But I am convinced that there is so much abuse in the horse industry because the horse industry attracts abusive people.
I full-heartedly agree with what Shelby Dennis just said. I've been in the horse industry almost 30 years in various capacities, and I have seen things, I have heard things, and it's not everybody. So I'm not saying that's everyone in the equestrian industry, but it really does seem to be an industry that attracts, for lack of a better word, abusive people. And, even though I'm all for the advocacy of horses and animal welfare, and I do speak to those issues publicly online, I've always been publicly hesitant to say what Shelby just said, even though I feel the same way. And the reason that has been the case is because it's a really hard thing for me to think about, that something that I love so much attracts or may attract abusive individuals. That's a really hard thing for me to think about and wrap my head around. So I've always been kind of hesitant to say it. And I also am hesitant to say it sometimes because I know there's so many good people in the horse world too. And I never want people to feel like I'm labeling every single person in the horse industry in that way, because it's definitely not true. But I also think that it is true, in my opinion, that the horse industry does seem to attract its fair share of abusive people within it. And I'm so glad that Shelby Dennis voiced that and put it out there, because I think it's a conversation that we actually need to start having. Like, we need to start asking why that is. If abusive people are attracted to the horse industry, why? Why? And how can we make the horse industry an environment that is not conducive to that is not welcoming to that, where an abusive person would say, hey, I don't want any part of that, right? And be hesitant to at all come into this horse industry. Now, I will explain to you why I think asking why something is happening is so important by using an example from the equestrian industry. So for most of my time of owning horses, I have boarded horses. And more than one time at a boarding facility, the people who ran that boarding facility told me why they were running a boarding facility and not doing something else instead. And what more than one of the people who ran those horse boarding facilities told me over the years was basically that they decided to run a horse boarding facility in the country because they didn't like rules and regulations in other industries, or like when they were living in cities. So they wanted to come out into the country where there were fewer rules and regulations and run a boarding facility, a horse boarding facility in particular. So basically, in short, they did not like following rules or having other people have expectations of them. So they decided to leave the city and their normal 9-to-5 job, come out in the middle of the country and run a horse boarding facility. Their answers weren't because they loved horses. Their answers weren't because they loved country life. It had to do with selfish reasons, which was basically they just didn't want to have expectations placed on them in other walks of life. So they went to a remote place where they would have the fewest expectations placed on them as was possible. Now, that isn't why everyone gets into the horse industry or boards horses, but I have heard that more than one time from people who got into boarding horses. And that to me is just not an acceptable reason for anybody to be getting into boarding horses or getting into the horse industry at all, that they're trying to have fewer rules and regulations placed on themselves. But it also says a lot about the horse industry itself, that it is an industry that has very few rules and very few regulations. So it really is kind of conducive to an environment, as in inviting to possibly abusive people to come into the industry because it has so very few rules and regulations associated with it. And I also want to make clear, and I should have made this clearer sooner, so I apologize, but I am talking about the horse industry in the United States. Other countries do seem to have better regulations in their horse industry than what the United States seems to have. Here, it seems very much like the Wild West, but like when I was in England, it was much more tightly controlled. So I am focusing on the horse industry in the United States when I talk about all of this. So anyways, that example I gave is just one example of why asking the question why is so important. If we can find out why something is happening, for instance, when people get into boarding horses, Some people get into boarding horses because they don't like rules and regulations and normal everyday 9 to 5 work in a city, for example. And so they come into an unregulated horse industry and get into horse boarding. Like, we ask why, we find out that's the why. How do we solve that why? Do we maybe put more regulations in place in the horse industry? Do we find some way to maybe have like more oversight in the horse industry, more accountability in the horse industry? And how can we do that? In what way can we do that? Like, could we do that by starting an entirely new organization that like has a certification program, for example, and each boarding facility has the opportunity to get certified with the organization. And to get certified, they have to meet some sort of checks and balances, and they have to be recertified, say, every year to make sure they're meeting those checks and balances every year. Or are there already like laws and rules and regulations that would already provide some of that oversight, but are just not being like used in that way? Because, sometimes rules and laws are made, but like nobody really enforces them. So do we already have like enforceable rules and laws on the books that could help us with that regulation and oversight already if we just utilize them properly? Or should we just create some new rules and laws that would benefit the horse industry more? And that, of course, is just one of many examples of the horse industry and how it could be conducive to abusive people and inviting for abusive people to come into it. Okay. And again, not everyone in the horse industry is like that. Not everyone who boards other people's horses is like that at all. So yeah, I'm really glad Shelby Dennis brought this up. I'm glad she voiced it. It's a conversation I think we should be having more of. I think we should be asking why this might be true, what Shelby Dennis said about abusive people seemingly being attracted to the equestrian industry. And by asking why, we can hopefully start coming up with solutions as to how we can try to prevent that going forward, as in how we can make the equestrian industry less conducive to people who might be of a more abusive nature. I would love your input on all of this. Like, what kind of why questions would you ask to figure out why somebody who had an abusive nature might be attracted to the horse industry, might come into the horse industry, and how we could solve that to try to prevent those people from ever coming into the horse industry to begin with? Like, how would we solve that why? Let me know in the comments below.